What if the road you traveled every day, the same stretch of highway you thought you knew by heart, was the very place where your life would end? Kristin Noel David was 22 years old when she disappeared on a warm summer afternoon in 1981. She was a senior at the University of Idaho, studying journalism and political science, a young woman known for her ambition, her intelligence, and the kind of promise that made people say, she's going to make something of herself. But on June 26, 1981, Kristin made what should have been an ordinary bike ride down Highway 95, a route connecting the university town of Moscow, Idaho to the small city of Lewiston. It was a ride she'd made before. A ride thousands of others had made. And yet, she never came home. To understand the weight of Kristin's story, you have to step back in time. Idaho in 1981 was a place of contrasts. College towns like Moscow carried a spirit of youth, music, and energy. But only miles away, the roads grew quieter, lonelier, stretching into long corridors of farmland and forest. Highway 95 in particular was both a lifeline and a vulnerability. It threaded together communities, but it also created isolation, long stretches of road where a young woman on a bicycle could be visible, but vulnerable. It was the kind of place where everyone thought they knew everyone else. Where people trusted their neighbors. Where doors weren't always locked. But under that surface of safety, something darker lurked. Friends described Kristin as responsible, hardworking, and focused. She worked at the campus radio station. She was often seen with notebooks in hand, scribbling ideas, chasing stories, building the skills she would need to one day tell the truth for a living. Kristin's professors admired her sharp mind. Her friends admired her warmth. She wasn't the type to disappear without a word. She wasn't the type to abandon plans. In fact, the summer of 1981 should have been filled with optimism. Kristin was weeks away from graduation. She was planning her future, perhaps a career in broadcast journalism, maybe moving to a bigger city. She had so much ahead of her. That makes what happened all the more devastating. June 26, 1981 began like any other. Kristin prepared for her bike ride, a routine she enjoyed. The 30-mile trip from Moscow to Lewiston was long, but not unusual for a young, active woman. She left her apartment in Moscow sometime in the afternoon. She wore casual clothes for cycling. She pedaled onto US Highway 95. And that's where the trail begins, and ends. Because that afternoon, people along Highway 95 noticed something. Witnesses would later recall seeing Kristin, or someone who looked like her, riding her bicycle. Some remembered seeing a brown van pull over near her. Others described a man stepping out, talking to her. But what exactly happened in those minutes remains one of the darkest mysteries in Idaho history. At first, Kristin's disappearance was local news, a missing college student, last seen biking to Lewiston. But soon, it became clear this was not a story about a lost hiker or a runaway. 9 days later, her dismembered remains were discovered in the Snake River. Wrapped in newspapers. Hidden in plastic bags. Deliberately concealed. And suddenly, Lewiston, Idaho was no longer just a quiet college town. It was the setting of a horror story. This case matters because it has remained unsolved for more than 40 years. Because whoever killed Kristin has never been brought to justice. Because her family, her friends, her community, they never got closure. And because cases like this remind us that violence can reach into the most ordinary of lives. When a case grows cold, it does something strange to memory. For the family, every year is a reminder that justice has not been served. For the community, details become whispers. Wasn't there a van? Weren't her remains found wrapped in newspapers? The story becomes blurred. But the horror never goes away. Kristin's murder is not just about the crime itself. It's about the vacuum left behind. The silence that follows when answers are never found. It's about the way people in the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley began to look at one another differently. Could it have been a stranger? A drifter passing through? Or was it someone they knew? Because here's the chilling part, Kristin's murder didn't happen in isolation. Between 1979 and 1982, a cluster of disappearances and murders haunted the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley. Several young people vanished or were killed. Some cases remain unsolved to this day. And so, even in 1981, whispers began, could this be the work of a serial predator? Was Kristin targeted because she was alone on her bike, or was she part of a larger, more terrifying pattern? When you study Kristin's life, one thing becomes painfully clear: she should never have been reduced to just a victim. She was a student, a daughter, a friend. She had ambitions, journalism, maybe even politics. She had her whole life ahead of her. And in that sense, her story represents something even larger, the fragile line between ordinary life and extraordinary tragedy. Think about it. You leave for a bike ride. You plan to come back. You never imagine that decision will become the last one you ever make. This case has endured because of its shocking brutality and its haunting questions. Why newspapers? Why plastic bags? Why dismemberment? Why were some remains found in the Snake River, and others never recovered? And perhaps most haunting of all, who was the man in the van? As the summer of 1981 unfolded, investigators began piecing together the puzzle of Kristin's final ride. Witnesses came forward. Leads trickled in. But what they found next would be even more disturbing than her disappearance itself. Because 9 days later, the Snake River gave up its secrets. The 4th of July in America is supposed to be a celebration: fireworks, barbecues, family gatherings, small towns glowing with community pride. But for the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley in 1981, Independence Day carried a different kind of explosion. Not fireworks in the sky, but horror in the water. Because on July 4th, fragments of a nightmare surfaced in the Snake River. And suddenly, Kristin Noel David's disappearance was no longer just a missing persons case. It was something far darker. 9 days after Kristin was last seen pedaling along Highway 95, 2 fishermen were out on the Snake River, casting lines near Silket Island. The water that day ran steady, dark, heavy with the weight of late summer. They were hoping for trout or bass. Instead, they saw something unnatural bobbing in the current. At first glance, they thought it was debris, maybe a bag of trash tossed from the shore. But as it drifted closer, the shape grew clearer. Human. It was a body part. Wrapped in black plastic. The fishermen froze. Shock set in before the reality did. They immediately alerted authorities. When police arrived, they began pulling evidence from the river, and what they found was more gruesome than anyone could have imagined. Kristin's body had been dismembered. Her remains were separated into multiple plastic bags. Some were wrapped in pages of the Lewiston Morning Tribune, dated just weeks before her disappearance. Think about that detail for a moment. Not only had her killer mutilated her, they had deliberately chosen to use newspapers from the local press. Was it a way to conceal her? A way to weigh her down? Or, and this is the disturbing possibility, was it a signature, a calling card? The coroner's report confirmed the brutality. Some remains bore clear signs of dismemberment with a sharp instrument. Her clothing and personal belongings, gone. Her bicycle, which should have been somewhere along Highway 95, never recovered. And one leg, to this day, has never been found. When word spread that body parts had been found in the Snake River, panic swept through the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley. This wasn't the sort of crime people associated with their community. Small towns in Idaho weren't supposed to be the backdrop for something so grisly. Parents warned daughters not to go out alone. Joggers stuck to crowded streets. The idea that a killer had dismembered a young woman and tossed her into the river wasn't just frightening, it was unthinkable. And yet, it had happened. Neighbors whispered about the kind of person capable of something like this. Was it someone passing through? A stranger nobody knew? Or, was it someone local? Someone they might have waved to at the grocery store, or sat next to at church? Investigators from multiple agencies swarmed the area. Local law enforcement, sheriff's deputies, even state investigators. They collected every fragment they could find from the Snake River. But immediately, they faced challenges. The water had damaged evidence. Some of the bags had drifted downstream, carried by the current. The scene was spread across miles. And without Kristin's bicycle, without her clothing, without a clear crime scene, investigators were piecing together a puzzle with missing edges. One thing, however, was undeniable: this was murder. Calculated, deliberate, and cruel. Among the most chilling details was the use of newspapers. Multiple parts of Kristin's remains were wrapped in Lewiston Morning Tribune pages from April 1981, about 2 months before her death. Think about the logistics. Someone had saved those papers. They weren't fresh off the press. They had been stored, maybe stacked in a garage or basement. That means premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion. Whoever did this had materials ready, thought about concealment, and executed the plan with disturbing care. It also suggested the killer was local. Outsiders passing through Lewiston wouldn't have access to old editions of the Morning Tribune. Whoever wrapped Kristin's remains had a connection to the community, or at least to the region. The official autopsy revealed no definitive cause of death, given the condition of the remains. But what could be determined was horrifying enough: Kristin had been dismembered after death. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a hit and run or a robbery gone wrong. This was deliberate mutilation. The forensic evidence told investigators they were dealing with someone who either had medical knowledge or the sheer brutality to cut apart a human body. And that raised the question: what kind of killer were they dealing with? The discovery of Kristin's remains sent investigators back to Highway 95. Witnesses had already reported seeing a young woman on a bike matching Kristin's description. Several claimed they saw her near Genesee, Idaho. Some mentioned a brown van. A man stepping out. Talking to her. Now, with the confirmation of murder, these witness accounts took on a terrifying new weight. Was the man in the brown van Kristin's killer? Descriptions varied, but the composite image that formed was chilling. A white male, early 30s, around 5 feet 10 inches, stocky build, with a beard. A brown van with swing-out back doors, maybe a sliding side door. Well kept. Local plates. The kind of vehicle that could blend in anywhere. The kind of man you wouldn't think twice about passing on the road. When the composite was released, tips poured in. People swore they'd seen that van. Some said they knew someone who fit the description. For weeks, rumors swirled. Every brown van in the valley became a source of suspicion. Every bearded man fit the description. But no lead ever solidified into an arrest. And as weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, the trail began to cool. Imagine the weight on Kristin's family. At first, they hoped she might simply be missing. That maybe she'd had an accident, or wandered off the road. But after July 4th, those hopes shattered. Instead of a rescue mission, it was a recovery. Instead of answers, only more questions. Why her? Why that day? Why that road? And perhaps the most haunting question of all: who had the time, the tools, and the cruelty to dismember her body, wrap it in newspapers, and scatter it in the river? The Snake River had revealed Kristin's fate. But it had not revealed her killer. Investigators had fragments, witnesses, a van, newspapers, a community on edge. But how do you solve a murder when the crime scene is the river itself? As detectives pushed forward, they began chasing every lead they could. From the man in the van, to the possibility of a transient stranger, to the whispers of a serial predator haunting the valley. And what they uncovered next would complicate the case even more, because Kristin's murder was not the only horror tied to Lewiston. There were others. And soon, investigators began to wonder if Kristin's killer was part of something much larger. By the summer of 1981, the Snake River had revealed what happened to Kristin Noel David. But the river had not revealed the killer. For investigators, that was the problem. They had a crime, they had evidence, they had horror, but they didn't have a name. And so the search began. One of the earliest and most tantalizing leads came from Highway 95 itself. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing Kristin cycling along the route that afternoon. And several swore they saw her talking to a man near a brown van. What if that fleeting roadside encounter was the last conversation of her life? Descriptions varied slightly, but the outline remained the same. The man, white male, late 20s to early 30s. Stocky. About 5 feet 10 inches. Beard. Hair ranging from reddish to brown. The van, brown, well kept. Swing-out rear doors. Possibly a sliding side door. Yellow license plates. To investigators, it was the first thread to pull. They canvassed the area. They tracked down every report of a brown van. They spoke with mechanics, neighbors, anyone who might have noticed such a vehicle. And here's where the frustration began. The valley was full of brown vans. Families used them. Tradesmen used them. Students even drove them. It was 1981, and vans were everywhere. Could the most ordinary vehicle on the road have hidden the most extraordinary crime? Investigators followed up with dozens of potential suspects. They questioned men who matched the description. They checked alibis. Some suspects seemed promising. But every time, the trail broke down. Either the timeline didn't fit, the van wasn't the right model, or the man had an alibi that checked out. And with each dead end, hope dimmed. Police found themselves asking, had the witnesses misremembered? Had fear colored their recollections? Or was the killer someone so ordinary that no one had truly noticed him? Another possibility emerged. What if Kristin's killer wasn't from Lewiston at all? The Snake River, after all, wasn't just a local landmark. It was part of a corridor, a highway system that allowed travelers to pass through unnoticed. Truckers, drifters, hitchhikers, transients. Maybe Kristin was unlucky enough to cross paths with someone passing through. Someone who could vanish into the landscape just as quickly as he appeared. But if it was a stranger, why newspapers from Lewiston? Why something so local? That detail, the wrapping of her remains in editions of the Lewiston Morning Tribune, haunted investigators. It suggested planning. It suggested someone who lived there, or at least stayed long enough to gather and keep those papers. And so, the stranger theory never fully explained it. As investigators dug deeper, another possibility surfaced, one that rattled the community to its core. Kristin's murder, they realized, wasn't the only unsolved case in the region. Between 1979 and 1982, multiple disappearances and murders plagued the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley. Young people, gone. Bodies turning up under mysterious circumstances. Was Kristin just one victim in a larger pattern? Some whispered about the Lewis-Clark Valley murders, a cluster of cases linked by geography, time frame, and brutality. Others speculated about the involvement of known serial killers, like Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who operated in the Pacific Northwest during that era. Was Kristin's death the work of one monster, or part of a string of evil that stretched far beyond Idaho? There was another mystery investigators could never solve: Kristin's bicycle. The blue 10-speed she left her apartment with that afternoon was never recovered. Not along the roadside. Not in the river. Not in any suspect's possession. It had simply vanished. And this raised haunting questions. Did her killer take it as a trophy? Hide it somewhere it would never be found? Or was it destroyed, like so much other evidence? To this day, the absence of the bicycle remains one of the most baffling aspects of the case. Sometimes what's missing screams louder than what's found. Without solid leads, investigators turned to profiling. Who could commit such a crime? Medical knowledge? Some argued the dismemberment showed skill, perhaps a butcher, a hunter, or someone with medical training. Local knowledge? The choice of newspaper suggested the killer had access to local materials. Calculated control? The way the remains were separated, bagged, and placed in the river showed planning, not panic. This was someone organized. Someone deliberate. Someone who took steps to cover his tracks. And that made him even harder to find. As weeks turned into months, rumors swirled. Some said they knew the killer. Others pointed fingers at local men with reputations for violence. A few whispered about someone who worked at the university. The case became not just a police investigation, but a community obsession. But the louder the rumors got, the quieter the evidence became. The 1980s weren't kind to cold case investigations. Forensic technology was limited. DNA profiling was still years away. Digital databases didn't exist. Investigators worked with fingerprints, witness statements, and whatever physical evidence they could scrape together. But the Snake River had washed away too much. By the end of 1981, despite intense effort, the case slowed. Leads went nowhere. Witnesses' memories grew fuzzy. Files began to gather dust. And Kristin's killer slipped further into the shadows. Still, one haunting question lingered: if Kristin's case was linked to the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley murders, that meant her killer hadn't stopped. He may have struck again. Because as the years passed, more and more families in the Lewiston area would lose daughters, sisters, loved ones to disappearances and murders that remain unsolved to this day. And soon, whispers grew louder. Maybe Kristin's killer wasn't just one man in a van. Maybe he was part of something much bigger. Something that would haunt the valley for decades. By 1982, the investigation into Kristin Noel David's murder had slowed. Leads had dried up, witnesses had gone silent, and the trail seemed to vanish into the Snake River's currents. But in the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley, tragedy didn't end with Kristin. Other families began to suffer. Other young people went missing. And soon, investigators and locals alike began asking the question that still lingers to this day. Was Kristin's murder just one crime, or was it part of a larger nightmare? Between 1979 and 1982, the quiet towns of Lewiston, Idaho and Clarkston, Washington, separated only by a bridge over the Snake River, became the epicenter of fear. 1979. Kristina White, 12 years old, vanished after attending a fair in Lewiston. She was never seen again. 1981, Kristin Noel David disappeared while biking Highway 95. Her remains were later discovered in the river. 1982, Christina Nelson, 21, and Jacqueline Brandy Miller, 18, disappeared while walking to a grocery store. They never returned. Their remains were discovered years later near Kendrick, Idaho. 4 young women. All gone within a 3-year span. All connected to the same small region. What are the odds that 4 young women would vanish or be killed in nearly identical circumstances, unless the same hand was behind them? The cases weren't identical, but they carried haunting similarities. Vulnerability: each victim was alone when she disappeared. Age: all were young, ranging from 12 to 22. Geography: all were last seen or found within the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley region. Vanishing acts: most disappeared while walking or biking along ordinary routes. It painted a chilling picture of someone who stalked the most vulnerable moments: a girl walking to the fair, a student riding a bike, 2 friends heading to the store. These weren't crimes of opportunity. These felt like patterns. If these cases were connected, that meant Kristin's killer hadn't acted once, but again and again. Locals began whispering about a single predator haunting the valley. Some suggested the killer was someone deeply familiar with the community. Someone who blended in, perhaps even respected publicly, but harbored a secret darkness. Others speculated that the killer was a drifter, a traveler using the highway system to stalk victims in small towns before disappearing into the next state. But the most chilling theory of all? That the killer stayed close. That he lived among them. That he walked the same streets, attended the same events, and watched the panic unfold. During the 1980s and 1990s, another serial killer terrorized the Pacific Northwest, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. He was eventually convicted of killing 49 women, with possible victims numbering over 70. Could Kristin have been one of them? At first glance, the timeline fit. Ridgway was active during the early 1980s. His victims were often vulnerable women. He disposed of bodies in rivers and remote areas. But upon closer inspection, there were differences. Ridgway targeted primarily sex workers around Seattle, nearly 300 miles from Lewiston. His method of strangulation differed from the dismemberment seen in Kristin's case. Investigators eventually concluded that Ridgway was unlikely to be responsible for Kristin's death. But the possibility of another serial killer, one operating specifically in the Lewiston area, remained chillingly plausible. If not Ridgway, then who? Could there have been another predator operating in plain sight? Over time, suspicion began to focus on certain individuals. One man in particular, whose name has been linked by researchers and journalists, seemed to hover around multiple cases. He was known locally. He worked in positions that gave him access to young people. He was reportedly near the last known locations of some victims. But despite circumstantial evidence and rumors, no charges were ever filed. His name has appeared in podcasts, documentaries, and online forums, but never in an indictment. Imagine living in a town where everyone whispers the same name, but the law can't prove a thing. One of the most distinctive details in Kristin's murder was the wrapping of her remains in Lewiston Morning Tribune newspapers. Why newspapers? Some believe it was simply a way to contain the remains. Others think it was to weigh them down. But one theory suggests it was symbolic, almost a taunt. Kristin had been a journalism student. She had worked at a campus radio station. She believed in the power of information, of truth. Was the killer mocking her by using newspapers to conceal her body? Was it a cruel irony, meant as a message? If that detail was intentional, it means Kristin's killer didn't just want her dead. He wanted her silenced. As the years passed, fear turned into a strange kind of silence. Families moved away. People stopped talking. For the David family, every holiday was a reminder of Kristin's absence. For the valley, every missing girl stirred old wounds. And in that silence, theories only multiplied. Some believed the killer had left town. Others believed he was still there, blending in, his secrets intact. Why was Kristin targeted? Was she chosen at random, or was she specifically hunted? Why newspapers from April 1981? Was that detail coincidental, or deliberate? Why were her remains dismembered, when other valley victims were not? Was Kristin's killer the same person who took Christina White, Christina Nelson, and Brandy Miller? Each question deepened the mystery instead of solving it. And the longer the questions went unanswered, the more powerful the silence became. In recent years, true crime researchers, journalists, and podcasters have revisited the Lewis-Clark Valley murders. They've interviewed retired detectives. They've combed through old files. They've connected dots that once seemed isolated. The theory that Kristin's murder was linked to a larger serial pattern has only grown stronger. And yet, after 4 decades, no one has ever been charged. No trials. No convictions. No justice. And that's the cruelest part of the mystery. Because even with suspects, even with patterns, even with whispers of a serial predator haunting the valley, the files remain cold. The evidence remains inconclusive. And Kristin's case, like so many others, sits unsolved. But why? Why, after 40 years, has no one been brought to justice? The answer lies not just in the crime itself, but in the limitations of time, technology, and memory. And that's where we go next. More than 40 years have passed since the summer afternoon when Kristin Noel David pedaled down Highway 95 and vanished into a nightmare. And yet, despite witnesses, suspects, and theories that span from drifters to serial killers, no one has ever been charged with her murder. How can a crime so brutal, so shocking, remain unsolved for 4 decades? To understand why, you have to step back into the world of 1981. There was no DNA profiling. No national database of fingerprints. No cell phone records. No surveillance cameras lining highways. Detectives relied on shoe-leather police work, knocking on doors, chasing tips, comparing witness statements. And when evidence was recovered from the Snake River, much of it was too damaged by water to yield clear clues. The plastic bags that contained Kristin's remains had been in the river for days, perhaps weeks. The newspapers were waterlogged, smeared, fragile. Even the human remains themselves had suffered from current, silt, and time. And so, investigators were left with fragments, haunting, but inconclusive. Another obstacle, jurisdiction. Kristin disappeared in Latah County. Her body was found in Assotin County, Washington. Witnesses spotted her near Genesee, Idaho. Multiple counties, 2 states, and several law enforcement agencies were involved. And coordination between them wasn't always smooth. Files were scattered, duplicated, sometimes even lost. Each office had its own priorities, its own resources, its own theories. What if the greatest barrier to solving Kristin's murder wasn't the killer, but the system itself? As forensic science advanced in the 1990s and 2000s, hope flickered. Cold case detectives revisited Kristin's files. Some evidence was reportedly preserved, the newspapers, the plastic, certain biological traces. Could DNA testing finally unlock the truth? The answer, heartbreakingly, was no. Either the samples had degraded too much, or there was not enough material to generate a usable profile. The very river that had hidden Kristin's remains had also erased her killer's fingerprints. And once again, silence. For Kristin's family, every anniversary is a reopening of the wound. Her brother has spoken in interviews about the devastation, about a sister whose laughter and future were stolen. Her parents, now gone, never lived to see justice. They carried the weight of uncertainty to their graves. Imagine living decades with no answers. Every time the phone rings, you wonder if it's the call. Every time a new suspect's name hits the paper, you wonder if this is the moment. And every time the case stalls, you're left to grieve all over again. For Kristin's family, the mystery wasn't just about who killed her, it was about why no one could stop him. Lewiston and Clarkston changed after Kristin's murder. Parents who once let their kids walk to the store alone suddenly kept them inside. Teenagers who once rode bikes down Highway 95 now looked over their shoulders. Trust was broken. And when other disappearances followed, Christina White, Christina Nelson, Brandy Miller, fear hardened into paranoia. Some locals whispered that they knew who it was. Others said law enforcement was protecting someone. A few even believed the truth had been buried intentionally. The valley was no longer just a home. It was a hunting ground. Over time, silence became its own prison. Witnesses grew older, memories faded, and fear kept some people from ever speaking up. What if someone had seen something but never reported it? What if someone knew the killer and chose to look away? Cold cases don't just suffer from lack of evidence. They suffer from the weight of silence. And in Kristin's case, that silence has stretched for more than 40 years. In recent years, however, Kristin's story has found new life. Podcasts, documentaries, and news outlets have re-examined her murder. The FBI renewed its call for tips on the 40th anniversary in 2021. Why? Because cold cases don't die. They wait. And sometimes, all it takes is one tip. One memory. One person finally breaking their silence. Could the clue that solves Kristin's murder already be out there, hidden in someone's memory, waiting to surface? Why newspapers? Coincidence, or deliberate symbolism? Why dismemberment, when other Valley victims weren't? Why was her bicycle never found? Was her killer a stranger passing through, or a local predator who walked among them? Every question leads to another. Every theory opens a new door. And that's why Kristin's case continues to haunt investigators, journalists, and ordinary people alike. Here's the most painful truth: time is both enemy and ally. As years pass, evidence degrades, memories blur, suspects die. But technology improves. Cold case units develop new tools. Genetic genealogy, advanced DNA recovery, AI-powered data analysis, all have given hope to families of victims once thought forgotten. Could Kristin's case benefit from these breakthroughs? Possibly. But only if the evidence preserved is enough to yield results. Kristin Noel David was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, a young woman with dreams. Her story forces us to remember that behind every headline, every theory, every cold case file, there is a life stolen and a family shattered. The enduring impact of her murder isn't just in the case files. It's in the way her community still whispers. It's in the way her family still grieves. It's in the way we still tell her story, because forgetting would mean the killer wins twice. And so here we are, more than 4 decades later. Kristin's murder remains unsolved. The newspapers remain a mystery. The van remains unidentified. The bicycle remains missing. But the story refuses to die. Because every time we speak her name, every time we revisit her case, we shine a light into the darkness that swallowed her. And maybe, just maybe, that light will finally reveal the truth. More than 40 years have passed since a young college student pedaled out of Moscow, Idaho, into the summer air, believing she would return. Her name was Kristin Noel David. She had dreams, she had a future, and she had a voice she intended to use, in journalism, in politics, in life. Instead, her voice was stolen. Her body was dismembered. Her remains were scattered in the Snake River. And her killer was never found. The cold reality. Despite witnesses, despite descriptions of a brown van, despite the chilling detail of newspapers wrapped around her remains, Kristin's case has never been solved. Decades of investigation. Dozens of suspects. Theories ranging from drifters to serial killers. And yet, nothing has ever stuck. The river kept too many of its secrets. And time has done the rest. But if time has erased so much, why does Kristin's story still haunt us today? Because it could be anyone. Kristin's story endures because it could be anyone's story. She wasn't living dangerously. She wasn't putting herself in reckless situations. She was riding her bike on a summer afternoon. The ordinariness of that choice is what makes the horror so profound. Because if something so terrible can happen to Kristin, it can happen to anyone. There is no statute of limitations on murder. And there is no statute of limitations on grief. Kristin's family has lived more than 4 decades without answers. Her parents died without knowing the truth. Her brother still waits. Every anniversary, every birthday she never got to celebrate, is a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. But delayed does not have to mean denied forever. Forensic science has advanced beyond anything investigators in 1981 could have imagined. Genetic genealogy has solved cold cases once thought impossible, cases older than Kristin's. New methods can pull usable DNA from degraded samples, can build family trees from the smallest trace. If enough evidence remains, Kristin's killer could still be identified. The question is the right evidence still there, waiting for someone to unlock it? Cold cases are not just about evidence. They're about memory. Someone out there knows something. Maybe they saw the brown van that day. Maybe they knew a man who suddenly got rid of his vehicle in the summer of 1981. Maybe they remember a strange comment, a nervous glance, a detail that didn't make sense at the time. For 40 years, those memories have been silent. But silence does not erase truth. And sometimes, truth only needs one person brave enough to break it open. So we ask you. What do you think happened to Kristin Noel David? Was she the victim of a passing stranger? Or was she targeted by someone who lived among her community? Was her murder connected to the cluster of unsolved cases that haunt the Lewiston-Clarkston Valley? Or was it a standalone act of horror, committed by one man who vanished as quickly as he appeared? Your theories matter. Your comments matter. Because every time her story is spoken, every time her name is remembered, Kristin lives on. True crime stories walk a dangerous line. They can sensationalize, exploit, or turn tragedy into entertainment. But Kristin's story is not entertainment. It is a reminder. A reminder of the fragility of safety, the cruelty of violence, and the responsibility we have to seek truth. Telling her story keeps her alive. It keeps the pressure on investigators. It keeps the memory sharp, so that when new evidence emerges, or when someone finally speaks, the world is ready to listen. Kristin Noel David was more than a victim. She was a sister, a daughter, a student, a friend. She laughed, she dreamed, she rode her bike through the summer light. She was ordinary, in the most beautiful way. And then she became extraordinary, because her story has endured for more than 4 decades. It endures because we cannot let it go. Because she deserves more than silence. Because the truth is still out there, waiting. And that is where we leave you. Not with answers. Not with justice. But with the same haunting question that has lingered since July 4, 1981. Who killed Kristin Noel David? If you have any information about Kristin's murder, contact the Idaho Cold Case Unit or the FBI tip line. Even the smallest detail could matter. And if you don't, you can still help by keeping her story alive. Share it. Comment. Remember her. Because killers thrive in silence. And Kristin deserves a voice. Thank you for watching. If you found this case compelling, we invite you to continue with us. In our next video, 5 cold cases solved by DNA in 2025. Stories of justice delayed, but not denied. Because every story like Kristin's deserves one thing, an ending.